Good morning, my name is Jack Wolf. Welcome to my channel, Impressions. This morning I may be a little distracted trying to share this Christmas story with you because there's a few notes that I want to be able to communicate to you that had great impact on my life, and I want them to impact you and maybe others in the same way. The year is 1914 and the context is war. The battles were taking place in a place called the Flanders Trenches. They were located below sea level, and they were kind of dug out of this greasy clay, and it was very waterlogged. And when it rained, it would turn those trenches into canals. And they were cold, they were miserable. It was a great breeding ground for fleas and rats and disease and all kinds of pestilence. And the worst part was this, the closest of the troops. They were only a few hundred feet apart in most places. The war began in August, and as the weeks and months passed, these two sides systematically killed each other. As Christmas approached, though, the voices of captains argued for a temporary ceasefire. The military leaders on both sides thought the idea was impossible and told their troops they should expect a surprise attack at Christmas. And they were warned that any soldier that tried to help a truce take place, they would be court-martialed. But Christmas Eve came. And it's hard to determine where it really started, but it started with some songs, some Christmas carols, and some military songs. And in most places, the singing went back and forth for a while, each side applauding and jeering one another's renditions of those songs. But then something strange happened. A soldier began to climb out of the trenches, and they began to approach each other in friendly ways. And an English soldier heard a German voice call out in English, "I'm a lieutenant. My life is in your hands. For I'm out of the trench and I'm walking towards you. Would one of your soldiers meet me halfway?" I don't have time to tell you the whole story. But instead of enemies fighting one another, the men were singing each other songs. And the truce grew for years and years. And many historians believed that the Christmas truce was just some exaggerated, isolated event that had been inflated by newspaper writers. But the truce was actually bigger than had been reported. It involved tens of thousands of men along 2/3 of the British-held line, and their interactions included eating, drinking, cooking, singing, playing soccer matches, exchanging photos, bartering, and yes, even burying the dead of one another. But how did it happen? This is where some detail is really important. The truce did not begin on Christmas. It began weeks before, when there was a steady flow of interactions that created bonds of safety and identity with one another. Tony Ashworth wrote a book called Trench Warfare, 1914 to 1918, and he writes about the physical closeness of the two sides. And while the closeness did bring violence, it also brought connection. The smells of cooking, the sounds of voices and laughter and songs, and soldiers on both sides became aware that they followed the same daily rhythms and routines of one another. Meals, resupply, troop rotations. Both sides had to deal with the hardship of military life. Both sides hated the cold and the wet. Both sides longed to be home with family and friends. But why this mutual empathy? It had to do with their proximity. But even more than that, it had to do with them getting to know one another. In the trenches, each adversary realized this, that the other person was not so different than themselves. Let me say that again, that each person was not so different than themselves. Listen, I listen to some news, I listen to some social media. This is a social media thing that I'm doing right here. But here's what I know, that there's so much hatred and venom in the world, in the newspaper, on social media, in the airwaves, completely filled with people battling one another. And while we're not using traditional weapons in our country, and there are certainly traditional weapons being used all over the world because of hatred, but we continue to fire at will. What would happen if we took some keys from that Christmas truce and realize that people are not so different than ourselves? What would happen if we spent more time with one another in close proximity? You know, Jesus spent time with people at a table. People got to know him. He got to know them. And guess what? Many of those men and women became a follower of him because they were up close and personal with the Lord himself. Other people kept Jesus at a distance and hated him and spewed things that were about his life that were not true. And those people were successful, nailing him to the cross. Yes, I know he had to go there for us. But the Christmas story is not just about family and friends, and it is about that. Jesus loves it when we get together with family and friends, and he loves it when we give gifts to one another. But the Christmas story is about peace on earth, goodwill to men. What would happen if in our country the people that hate each other so much began to have backyard barbecues, begin to hang out with their families and realize that their families are not so different than themselves? Yes, we still may have different points of view, but I think the way we treat one another would be so different. Because we're isolated, we're disconnected, we're allowing our fingertips to do the talking. We're allowing thousands of miles to separate us and share points of view and keep things stirred up in a negative way. One time I was in traffic, and I don't remember how this happened, whether it was me or them, but I remember there was some traffic interaction where I cut somebody off or they cut me off, and I was kind of ticked about it. And then I got beside the car and realized it was one of my neighbors. And do you know what? Immediately, my attitude changed toward that situation. I thought, oh, hello there, because we've had backyard barbecues together. Yes, proximity matters. Closeness matters. You can have a different point of view, but remember this: people are not so different than yourself. They have families and friends that they love very much. We would do much better this time of year and in years to come to think about this Christmas truce and how enemies became friends. And by the way, there was a corporal that heard about this Christmas truce, and he didn't like it. And here's what he said. He said, such a thing should not happen at wartime. His name was Adolf Hitler. You know, I know that's an impactful thing to say, but we have no room for hatred. We only have room for love. Let's open up our hearts. Let's look at people and say to ourselves, they're not so different than me, really. I hope you have a great time around the Christmas table. I hope your meal is wonderful and rich. I hope that your time with your family is meaningful. And I hope that when you're out and about, that you look at a stranger and say, they're not so different than me. And that you have a beautiful time. Happy New Year. God bless.